The Nazis' war crimes and crimes against humanity caused the need for a judicial frontier known as the Nuremberg Trials. While the world received the trials with mixed success, they established international law that today protects human rights during times of peace and war. World War II crimes caused a need for the Nuremberg Trials because the Axis committed many war crimes and crimes against humanity. Some of them are massacres, looting, forced labor, murder of Soviets, and extermination of Jews. It was started by fear and discrimination. There was a handwritten letter from the trials written by Paul M. Herbert that said, "There could hardly be any doubt in 1938 and 1939 that Hitler would not hesitate to use force if necessary to solve Germany's territorial problems as viewed by the Nazi Party." The war crimes and crimes against humanity caused there to be a new type of crime system to prevent prisoners and people from getting harmed by these crimes. It states from the ICJ, war crimes, violations of the laws or customs of war which include, but are not limited to, murder, ill treatment or deportation to slave labor or for any other purpose of civilian population of or in occupied territory, murder or ill treatment of prisoners of war, of persons on sea, killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property, destruction of cities, towns, or villages, or devastation not justified by the military necessities. The Nuremberg trials helped make war crimes clearer than the guidelines of human experimentation in 1931. 3 out of the 23 defendants at the doctor's trial were accused of doing medical experiments on inmates. Since the Nuremberg trials, there has been a whole lot more action on the topic of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Allied Control Council, also known as the Four Powers, was a government-based group of the Allies. Operating out of Berlin, they attempted to repair Europe of its damages in the war, even though they had many different views on how to do it. Britain wanted to execute anyone directly involved to the trial. On the other hand, the Soviet Union expected a fair joint tribunal, which is an international trial. The charter made new rules, regulations, and bypasses to fully complete the trials at Nuremberg, Germany. Before the case was taken to court, different goals between the Allies made it difficult to establish this frontier. There were certain things that the charter could do that they weren't allowed to do before. For example, the Holocaust itself was illegal, but the people involved were not recognized as committing any crimes, so their sentences were not as brutal as they should have been. Post-trial, international legal principles were enacted, which created a way to prosecute the criminals even if their specific crime was not stated. Nuremberg was also the reason many international documents were created, such as the Universal Declaration of Rights and the Nuremberg Principles, which address the newly created war crimes and crimes against humanity and their relation to how they are used at trial. The Nuremberg Code would be more reliable if the ICC or International Criminal Court and others would improve it over time. It has no legal force and is just an improved version of the 1931 Guidelines of Experimentation. There are poorly worded sections in Article 5 and Article 10, which provide loopholes for investigators to perform sketchy trials. The articles state, no experiment should be conducted if it is believed to cause death or disability, and the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment when injury, disability, or death is likely to occur. They didn't get to try Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Paul Joseph Goebbels, which would have provided more information. Unfortunately, before they were tried, they all committed suicide due to cyanide pills. They also left out the definition of war, being a universal crime. The trials were confusing to create because Justice Robert Howard Jackson had to decide what components from two different types of law to be put in. The two laws are the common law and the continental law. Even though it hasn't been improved in 60 plus years, it is still a foundation for human rights. It was just as important to the public how the trial went as the actual sake of the trial was. The public reacted to the judicial frontier with a mixture of praise and contempt. About 4 months after the trials began, interest in them began to decrease. It was starting to get lengthy, and people were getting tired of it. Once the trial was announced to be over soon in August of 1948, the interest in them grew back. When the final verdicts were announced, some thought that everything went well, and others thought there wasn't enough information provided. 71% claimed that the ones being convicted were wrongly tried and were actually innocent. 41% thought that the lesser leaders should have also been tried since the higher leaders were convicted. By the end of the trial, that December, 70% of the people said that they felt the defendants were in fact guilty, and 60% said that the punishments were reasonable. However, there was still criticism. There were complaints about how the victims were represented in the trial. Nevertheless, one of the actual victims, Primo Levi, that was tried, actually complimented the German government and said that he felt properly represented. The religious community felt both grateful and angry towards this frontier. The German Protestant churches were quite friendly with the Nazis. Many of the leaders, priests, and theologians were friendly with the Nazis, which lower members of the church were uncomfortable with. However, the German Catholic churches were quite the opposite. Any bishop or priest involved with the Nazis were not allowed to be associated with the church. The lower members were actually quite angry with that, since the law at the time stated that the Christian people couldn't be in association with Jewish people, which outraged them, since many were in relations with each other. The two ultimately represented polar opposites. Still, as time grew on, both churches formed resentment for the Nazi Party and grew on to dislike Hitler's ways. Soon after, Nazi officers began arresting priests for speaking out against the extremist party. After this incident, both churches began speaking carefully about what they said and apologized for previous actions. All in all, the Nuremberg Trials have affected history in many ways: people, customs, and of course the law. It has influenced the way international courts decide the correct way to prosecute criminals, and our world would be a very different place without it.